The basis for our lasagna sauce is a meatloaf or meatball mix that you can find in most grocery stores. It's essentially a mix of ground beef, ground pork, and ground veal. And it's not very expensive. If you cannot find this in your grocery store, then certainly ground beef will suffice. This just has a little more flavor. We start the lasagna sauce by browning the meatloaf mix, and this is about 1.25 pounds of meatloaf mix. We brown it over medium heat for about 5 or 10 minutes until it's browned through, and then we'll drain the meat off and then move on to the next part of the sauce, which will be our mirepoix and the tomato sauce portion. Our meat is browned, and we're just draining off the extra fat, which there wasn't much of. We want to make sure we drain it off. And then we've also done with a medium dice our mirepoix. Again, that's onion, celery, and carrots. I would guess this is about 1.5 cups of onions, and maybe 3/4 cup of celery and carrots. But we are eyeballing it at this point, and we're going to stick these in the pot to saute. Now saute these root vegetables off.
Can I get it in?
Yeah. So we have our pan warming up. We're going to sweat out our onions, celery, and carrots. So I'm going to put into here a few tablespoons of olive oil, extra virgin. I know some people don't like to saute an extra virgin. I don't have a problem with it. And we'll transfer our vegetables. Add a little salt, call it about a teaspoon. This is kosher salt. Get the vegetables evenly coated with the olive oil, and then we'll slowly sweat at medium to medium-high heat. The vegetables are sweated for about 6 or 7 minutes. So we're just going to squeeze in this case, about 5 cloves of garlic. That's because I like garlic. That's good for you. We'll stir that in, get that heated up. The next step is going to be to deglaze this pan. You can see some brown bits on the bottom. Most of that's meat from our saute of the meat, or browning of the meat. And we're using the same pan for that. We're going to hit this pan with about 1/2 cup of wine. Bring that up to temperature. And we're going to use some crushed tomatoes, and the tomatoes that we use are these Cento brand. They're a little more expensive. I think this can is like $2.89 or $3 a can. We like these tomatoes because they have a lot of body and a lot of thickness, which prevents us from needing to use any tomato paste in the recipe. Into this goes about 1 cup of the sauce. We're making a very savory sauce, almost like a gravy. The tomatoes act as a sweetening and acidifying agent, but they're not meant to be the main show. It's the meat and the mirepoix that come out more often in this. I'm going to let this come up to heat, and then we're going to add some herbs and some water. Because the idea is to let this go low and slow for a couple of hours. Let the meat really break down, almost to a cat food-like consistency. At which point we will then boil off all the moisture, or most of the moisture, just to stiffen up the sauce. You know I'm not big on measurements. Into our sauce we're going to put about a tablespoon of basil, dried, and an equal amount of oregano, dried. Stir that in and add some water to loosen the mixture up. Notice we have not put the meat in yet. We have one more step to do before we put the meat in. Put some filtered water in. And we'll let this come to a simmer. The point here is to get the carrots to be completely soft for the next step, which is to essentially puree the liquid part of this so that we don't have those big chunks of carrot, celery, and onions, and they become fully incorporated into the sauce. The tool we're going to use in this next part is an immersion blender. This is a simple one. They're relatively inexpensive to find on the internet. They're great for soups, if you're making a squash soup or a pumpkin soup. They're terrific. In this case, we're going to use this to grind up in the actual pot itself the bits and pieces to make a very, very smooth sauce. I will say you could still take the sauce out of the pot, and although it's very hot, you can put it into a blender and have the same impact. This is a little safer, a little easier, and frankly, a little easier to wash. It just comes apart. This part goes in the dishwasher. This part goes back in your drawer, and then put them back together when it's ready. All right, we have simmered the sauce for an extra 10 minutes just to make sure all the vegetables are soft. Now we'll use our immersion blender to grind up the contents. What you're really trying to do here is to make sure, especially if you have small kids, that all the carrots are ground down into a paste so they're not discernible in the lasagna. Otherwise your kids will call you out and they'll refuse to eat the lasagna. At least my kids. Keep moving the sauce around, create a well by turning the pot over. If you see any large chunks, go after them. Oops. Like there's one. And then what you're left with is a very nice puree, which will be the base for our meat sauce. Now, we will introduce back to the sauce the meat that we browned off. We'll stir that in. And we'll turn the heat up to bring that back up to a simmer, and then we'll simmer this until it gets down to a thick consistency. You could simmer this all day long if you wanted to, and just make sure you keep coming back and adding moisture to it in the form of water. But at this point for us, because we're trying to eat a little more quickly, we'll start simmering it and stirring it occasionally to start to reduce the quantity of liquid in the pan and to dry it out, at which point it'll become the basis for our sauce. The pan we're going to use today is by Crate & Barrel. Can't remember how old this is. We've had it for a while. It is 10 inches by 10 inches with a slightly flared side. And this happens to work perfectly to allow 4, I'll show you this, but it's basically 2 across of these Barilla oven-ready lasagna noodles to be placed. You can certainly change this from a 10 by 10 to a lasagna size 10 by 13 pan or 9 by 13 pan. You'll need to make a little bit more base sauce. This happens to work out well for us. We have enough food for us for dinner, and then there's always food for leftovers the kids seem to love. Let's talk about these Barilla pasta sheets for a second. What we like about them is that they're no boil. They're basically just dehydrated sheets of pasta that soak up the moisture from the sauce, which we like. It means we don't need to pre-cook them. However, given the dimensions of our pan, and we like to have our pasta, at least on our base level, going up the edges, we do need to boil a few of these to give them a little bit of elasticity so that we can lay them properly in the lasagna pan. So we're getting a pot of water boiling, slightly salted, and we'll boil 4 of these at a time for a total of 8 to make sure we get the bottom and sides of the pan properly coated, and I'll show you how we do that. I parboiled 4 sheets of the pasta for about 2 minutes. I'm going to lay them out in the pan. And basically what this is going to do is create a double layer of pasta on the bottom. These 4 sheets go along east-west. We will repeat the process and put 4 sheets across north-south. We have the second layer of the pasta base, and again these are pre-boiled pieces. Just going to lay these across the bottom, north-south direction, overlapping the original pieces. If there's a little bit of tearing, don't worry, you won't notice it when you eat the pasta. Oops. Sometimes you need to use your hands, even if it's hot. Ow! So you can see here, not only do we have the layers of pasta laid, but we have these flaps, and you'll see how we use these flaps later. What they'll do, though, is they will contain the entire lasagna after we build it. The next step is to check on the meat and to create our bechamel sauce, which we'll use in between each layer. Now that the sauce has been cooking, this sauce has been cooking for a couple of hours, and you can see a lot of the moisture has left it. The sauce has tightened up quite a bit. It's coming away from the bottom. It smells great in here. What we will do is season it and then set it aside. But I think the sauce itself, or the base for the lasagna, is essentially done at this point. You'll notice the consistency too. You know, I mentioned, it's a horrible metaphor, but like cat food, the meat has really broken down. If the meat doesn't break down as quickly as you'd like for yourself, what I have used in the past is a potato masher to help break up some of the clumps of meat. That seems to do a pretty good job of helping to accelerate this process. So we're going to set this aside and then move on to the bechamel. A bechamel is essentially a white sauce with milk as its main ingredient, and it's thickened with a combination of butter and flour. We start with a roux of that butter and flour, and so for this bechamel, which will yield about a little over a quart of sauce, we start with half a stick of butter and as much flour as that butter will accept to make the roux. We've started the roux with half a stick of butter and about half a cup of flour. We first melted the butter and added the flour all in one hit, and now we are slowly cooking it over a medium flame. This will create the roux that thickens the milk. We're using a whisk for this, partially because when we add the milk, we'll need a whisk to help break up the clumps. But it also helps stir the components of the roux. What you'll see here, the roux is very tight right now. The flour and the oils in the butter are not fully cooked, and so you see these big dry clumps. As we let this cook for a minute or so, what you'll see is that the roux will sort of loosen up, and you'll see some of it start to weep a little bit in the pan. That's when you... As we let this cook, the tightness of the roux will fade somewhat. And what we're going for is a blonde roux here. We don't want it to have any color. We want the bechamel at the end to be white. And you can see now, even though we've only been cooking it for a minute or so, that it's starting to loosen up at the bottom of the pan. And that's how we know we've cooked out a lot of the starches that can give the bechamel a kind of cakey or floury flavor. And you can see now this is the same mixture we had just a minute ago, and it's no longer clumpy. So that means it's time to add the milk. Into this, we're going to add, this is a quart of whole milk. We start by adding about half of it and incorporating the roux in with the milk, and it will thicken up rather quickly as the milk heats up. We will also put about half a teaspoon of salt, for a true bechamel, one of the main ingredients is nutmeg. And we have a nutmeg grinder here. I'm going to put some grinds of nutmeg in here to help season the sauce. So we'll bring this up to temperature. As it starts to get close to a boil, it will thicken, at which point we'll add the balance of the milk to make the full batch of the bechamel. It's been about 2 minutes, and you can see how this first introduction of milk has thickened up the sauce. We're going to add the balance of the milk now. And we'll whisk that in with a whisk. We used this only to clean down the sides, but the whisk is the most effective at incorporating it all together. And we'll taste it along the way to make sure we've got enough seasoning in this. This will take another 3 to 5 minutes at medium heat to get up to temperature and for the entire batch of bechamel to thicken up. So we have our bechamel, we have our meat sauce, we have our noodles, and we have some mozzarella cheese. Sorry, it's from a bag. And now we're just going to do multiple layers. We'll start by ladling in some bechamel along the bottom. Then some of our meat sauce. The bottom layer is sort of your most important layer because it's the one you're going to taste most. So don't be skimpy on the meat. So we just do a little bit to spread it out. We've layered on the bechamel, some meat sauce, and some mozzarella cheese. And now we're going to take the dried pasta and lay it out. And we've got a few extra strips here that we've kept. First layer is done. Next layer, some more bechamel. And that will also help to cook the uncooked pastas. The balance of the meat. Spread that around, roughly. Make sure we have all the goodies in here. And then 2 more sheets of pasta. Two more scraps of pasta. And we're essentially done with the layering, but now you're going to see where the flaps come in. I'm just going to turn these flaps in onto the lasagna. I'm just going to pour the balance of the bechamel onto the top of the lasagna. So what's notable about this lasagna? Well, first of all, cheese does not play a big role. We do have the mozzarella we put in. There's no ricotta, and the mozzarella that we put in here was relatively small. I'm going to spread around the bechamel, which is sort of the proxy for the cheese. I'm going to just move it up to the edges. And this particular lasagna is ready to go to an oven. We'll put this into an oven for about 400 degrees for about 30 to 40 minutes until it's cooked through. You'll know it's done when the top is all crispy and slightly brown. We will use a pizza peel to put this in the oven, one of our favorite tools, because this is now a rather heavy piece. The alternative is to just put this into the fridge at this point, let it cool down, and then put it in later on in the day or even a couple of days later. Lasagna just pulled out of the oven, nicely browned on the top. The nice thing about lasagna, it is such a heat sink. It will hold so much of the heat for a while. And if you were to cut into this lasagna right now, the insides would fall all over the place. So we're going to let this sit and cool and set up for about 10 minutes before we slice into it.